I'm James Winter, the Internet's private investigator. Do you know when private investigators in Ontario are obligated to identify themselves as private investigators? Well, stick around. I'm going to explain it to you. I've been a private investigator in the province of Ontario for 30 years now. And one of the biggest areas of confusion is, when does the private investigator have the obligation to identify themselves as a private investigator? This is especially important for investigators who are on surveillance or undercover. A lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people have opinions that are just based on, I don't know what. And that includes lawyers and agency owners. None of these people have ever gone to the legislation, the Private Security Investigative Services Act, which is the legislation that governs private investigators in the province of Ontario. None of them seem to go to that act, and when they do, they seem to have missed an important piece of the puzzle. What's that piece of the puzzle? We're going to go to the act and have a look at it. But before we do that, I just want to discuss something called holding out as a private investigator versus acting as a private investigator. They're not the same thing. Let me explain. Here we have a slide, definitions of holding out as versus acting as a private investigator. The legislation is very interesting, and repeatedly, if you look through the PSISA, the Private Security Investigative Services Act, over and over again, it talks about holding out as a private investigator or acting as a private investigator. They're not the same thing. Let's define holding out as a private investigator. This is when a person presents himself as being something, in this case, a private investigator, or portraying himself as a private investigator. So if a person is holding themselves out, it means they are presenting themselves or portraying themselves as a private investigator. It's not the same thing as acting as a private investigator. Acting as means doing the work of the private investigator. So I might be doing the work of a private investigator without ever holding out as a private investigator. If I'm on surveillance, if I'm undercover in a factory, I'm doing both of those things, the work of the private investigator, without actually holding out as a private investigator. Why is that important? Let's look at the legislation, see what it says. The Private Security Investigative Services Act of 2005, a Ontario legislation, this is the legislation that literally governs the work of private investigators in the province, says this. When do private investigators have the obligation to identify as private investigators? Well, it says here in section 34, every person who is holding himself or herself out as a private investigator shall carry the license, on request identify him or herself as a private investigator, and on request produce the investigator's license. But when? When do they have to do that? When they're holding out as private investigators, not when they're acting as private investigators. A surveillance investigator is acting as a private investigator, though not holding out as a private investigator. The surveillance investigator is holding out as a member of the public. Just a guy driving down the street. That's the holding out as, though acting as a private investigator. The private investigator working as a worker on an assembly line in a factory undercover is acting as a private investigator, though not holding out as a private investigator. Let's contrast that with the same legislation. What does it say about security guards? Section 35, next section, says, under the Private Security Investigative Services Act, says security guards, every person who is acting as a security guard or holding out as a security guard must carry the license, identify as a security guard when asked, and on request produce the security guard's license. So you can see here this legislation, or same legislation, in this section of the legislation, when the security guard is acting as a security guard or holding out as a security guard, they have the obligation to carry the license, identify as a security guard, and then produce the license on request. Let's contrast. Let's go back to the investigators. Same legislation. The private investigator who is holding out as a private investigator must carry the license, identify as a private investigator, and produce the license. And when does a private investigator hold out as a private investigator? Not so often. I've done it. Let's say I'm going to interview witnesses for a car accident, for example. I might call somebody up, go meet with them, and introduce myself. Say, "Hi, I'm James Winter. I'm a private investigator. I'm doing an investigation for a car accident that happened 6 months ago, and you were a witness to that car accident. I'm holding out. I've identified myself as a private investigator. I'm holding myself out as that thing while I'm also acting as a private investigator. I'm doing both." In that case, if they say, "Well, James, I just want to see your identification," I'm going to say, "No problem. Take out my license and present it to them. I'm holding out as a PI. That's my obligation." But the undercover investigator doesn't have that obligation. The surveillance investigator, the guy following an insurance claimant, does not have the same obligation. So if that investigator gets approached by a neighbor and says, "I'm just sitting here in my car doing nothing," and that neighbor says, "Hey, I think you're a private investigator. You have to identify yourself and show me your license," that's not true. The investigator is not holding out as a PI. The investigator is holding out as just a regular member of the public sitting in his car. Same in a factory or in a warehouse. Undercover investigation. The investigator is undercover, acting as a private investigator, doing the work of a private investigator, though not holding out as a private investigator. In that case, someone approaches him and says, "Hey, I think you're a PI." He denies it and has no obligation to identify himself or herself. So I hope it's clear that the private investigator who's holding out as, presenting him or herself as a private investigator, will have the obligation to produce the license and acknowledge they're a private investigator in those circumstances. But any undercover investigator, any investigator who's on surveillance, any investigator who's working undercover, any type of undercover work, has absolutely no obligation under the Acts of Ontario to identify as a private investigator or show their identification. So just to wrap it up, if you're an experienced investigator, I hope this clarifies things for you. If you're a new investigator, I hope it gives you another tool to do your job more safely. And if you're interested in becoming a private investigator in the province of Ontario, reach out to me. I'm James Winter. You can find me by email at james@jameswinter.ca or online, www.jameswinter.ca. We will introduce you to a series of courses that are going to help you establish yourself in your new career. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.